So a difference this cycle is that this documentation will be submitted via email to transit.programs@dot.ohio.gov. So we have actually created a mailbox that is very generic for these purposes, so that you have one place to send this. We can then save it internally, work with our Office of External Audits internally, making sure that you've submitted everything that's required based on the budget you're submitting in your application, and it can just be done in a more coordinated and effective way. So again, only applies to people receiving rural transit dollars for these 3 types of projects. Okay, so project information in the application. I want to have another disclaimer here. Only projects listed in your LOI acceptance notification can be applied for. So you received an email, and we made sure to bullet out exactly what projects were accepted based on your LOI. If you come into this there is no safety mechanism in this application to where you put your name in and the application knows, oh, this organization's only eligible for this, I'm only going to show these options. It will show you every project type. And so therefore you technically are able to go through and submit information for projects that you weren't approved for, but we will not review it on our end, even if it's submitted in your application. So it's just a waste of your time if you're going through and submitting applications for projects you were not approved for. So please make sure you're verifying that acceptance notification against the project you're ultimately applying for. We do ask, and I go into this in a little bit more detail, but it is important enough, I think, for me to reiterate. With each project, we are asking you the project quantity, because that will kind of dictate how many sections you see for how much unique information you can provide. So a quick note on vehicles. A separate vehicle project will be submitted for each vehicle request. This applies to urban and rural providers. If you are applying for 2 vehicles, you need to say the quantity is 2 and actually submit information for each vehicle. So even if it's 2 of the same exact vehicle, still separate projects. Capital projects. So the way that we want applicants to consider capital requests, so like software requests, equipment requests, etc., is consider them by procurement. If a project would require a separate procurement, then it would be a separate request. So let's think of an example like you're going to be applying for tablets for your buses, and those tablets are going to be used with a new dispatching software, but they're going to be completely separate purchases, completely separate projects. While they're related, they're going to be separate requests because you would be procuring them separately. So I hope that example kind of makes sense. But again, if in doubt, please reach out and we can let you know, oh, that can be grouped as one project or represent that separately. And that's why I kind of want to give you guys a heads up now, because you can use the next week and a half before the application is published to reach out to us and kind of work through maybe some of those questions you have about how you should structure your application to be compliant with our requirements. So I do have an important note on vehicles. So as many of you know, the vehicles there's quite a backlog for vehicle requests due to nationwide shortages in labor and parts and the manufacturing plants, being shut down. So because of that, we have over 100 vehicles that have been awarded and in the process of being ordered over the past 2 application cycles that don't even have delivery dates. So because of that, it is safe to assume that vehicle projects submitted through this application cycle are likely not to be delivered in calendar year 2023. We're looking at 2024, maybe even early 2025, depending on the vehicle type. So because of that, we will not be using state funds to fund vehicle projects. And the reason for that is When it comes to our state funding, we only have a certain window of time to encumber those funds. And once we enter a new state fiscal year, we can no longer change those encumbrances in any way. That funding is locked in. And so because of the nature of vehicle projects and how long it's going to take for vehicles to actually be delivered to your site, things could drastically change in that period of time. And if we lock funding in to an encumbrance in this state fiscal year, and then you ultimately decide, hey, I was able to get a vehicle locally, I don't need that, or, something happens, we can't change that project anymore. If we cancel that project, we lose the funding. So just because of that, we're not going to lock our state funding in to vehicles for this cycle. So federal funding will be how we consider it. But when it comes to federal funding, we are going to look at good projects that can actually take place and be completed in calendar year 2023 before we consider vehicle requests. Now, as I mentioned in the funding slide, we have quite a bit of funding available due to the stimulus funds being in place for a couple of years. So I still think that we will be able to award vehicles. So I don't want people to worry too much about that. But our priority, our number one consideration will be, what projects can actually take place and be completed. We understand that it's also going to be important to earmark funds for vehicles and get vehicles in the queue, so to speak, for ordering. And that's why we're still including vehicles as an eligible project and putting them in our grants and all of that because of the situation we're in with this timeline. But I just want to be transparent about that and how kind of we're making decisions internally behind the scenes. So the other thing is, because of that massive backlog, you have transit operators that are still operating fleets of vehicles that are beyond their useful life because they still haven't gotten vehicles they were awarded in the past cycles to replace those. But it's important to remember that if you are going to be seeking vehicles through this application cycle, consider the vehicles that you have been already awarded that haven't been delivered, and make sure you're not duplicating requests. So if you requested a replacement vehicle last cycle and you said, vehicle number 23 in our fleet is the one that needs replaced, and we awarded that. And now you're moving into this cycle and you're like, well, we still have number 23 needs replaced and now number 46, and don't include 23 again because we've already awarded you a vehicle for that, if that makes sense. So just consider that, even if you don't have those vehicles on site and it might feel like you don't have a replacement vehicle, you do. It's in process, and do not duplicate that request because we will check it and we won't award it if it's already been kind of replaced on paper, so to speak. Okay, so now I'm going to go through the type of information that we're requesting by project. And then I will show you by project type what applies. So for each unique project, we are going to ask you the goals associated with your project. Now, these will be predetermined goals, and they're actually associated with our programs, but this is how we are going to determine what ODOT programs could ultimately fund that project. So for example, OTP2 has up to 6 goals between Tier 1 and Tier 2. And then you have the 5310 program has goals, 5311 has goals, and 5339 has goals. So what we've done is we've taken all those goals and we have them as a checklist, and you will go through and check all that apply. So if your project is going to remove barriers for seniors and individuals with disabilities, you'll check that. If your program is going to preserve public transportation fleets, you'll check that. And then that way on our end, we're like, hey, this project is meeting the goals of 5310 and OTP2. And so we can consider that under both of those programs. So that's kind of why you see a predetermined set of goals, and why you are also instructed to check all that apply to that project. Now, don't think you can just go through and check every box, because there will be a narrative that pops up that says, please explain how your project will address the goal of preserving transportation fleets, for example. And you will actually have to relate your project to those goals, so that, you know, people aren't encouraged just to check everything to maximize eligibility without it actually being related to the project. Population served. So this is where we're going to ask you the segments of the population. So general public, low income, seniors, individuals with disabilities. You're going to check all that apply. And again, that's for our purposes, because, you know, if your project's going to address seniors and individuals with disabilities, for example, you might be eligible for 5310. So again, we are trying to maximize your eligibility to the fullest extent possible. Project priority. So we are asking applicants to prioritize each project request. This is going to help us on our end to know, if you submitted 10 projects, which projects are you like, if I can only have one, this is it. So with that in mind, one is the highest priority project, and this should be a unique field, meaning, you know, don't put one for 2 projects. If you put one, you can only submit one time. So, you know, kind of think about that ahead of time, going into your application. Okay, I know I have these projects, and if I had to pick, this is how I'm going to do it. And then that way, once you get into your application, it should be, you know, easy. And that goes for vehicles too, right? So if you're accepting or you're requesting 6 vehicles, you're going to have to prioritize each one of those vehicles. We don't just consider vehicle requests, it's a priority 3, and that applies to all of them. You have to prioritize each unique project. Project description. So the project description field in the application is just a short answer. So what we're looking for there is just a brief description, right? If you're applying for shop equipment, it is just a brief description of what it is, you know, a lift, whatever. It doesn't have to be this long thing. You know, I am requesting a lift for our vehicles to serve blank XYZ for this purpose, because we're already kind of asking you that information by asking you what goals it is, by asking you the population served, what your priority is. We just need a very brief description of what the project actually is. Project start and end date. So this primarily applies to capital projects, and it's kind of relates to procurement. So we want to know on our end, right, if you're requesting this capital project, when do you estimate actually starting that procurement, and when do you anticipate ending that procurement? Because that gives us an idea of when we can expect to expend and funds and close the project. So, you know, projects that can be done in 3 months, great. Projects that might take 18 months, you know, we're gonna weigh that, you know. Like I mentioned earlier, we want to look first at good projects that will actually be completed within the program year. That helps us on our end in expending funds and closing projects and closing federal grants in some cases. So that's why we consider those that way. Local match sources. So, I mean, this is especially relevant for federal funds. As many of you know, there are eligibility requirements for local match sources. And so when you are going into your application, if you're applying for vehicles, we will say, you know, what is your local match sources, and what are the amounts that those sources are providing for your vehicle purchases. We do not ask you to repeat this for every project. So if you are applying for 6 vehicles, you will not have to fill out that local match information for each vehicle. We just ask in the vehicle project information section that you summarize that for all vehicle requests, and then that should ultimately match the total local match that you will be contributing for your vehicles.